So basically, I'm going to talk about the UI plugins and components in Angular and how you can master that level when it comes to designing your own template code so that you can really make the most out of your AngularJS application. Before I start, about myself, so I've worked on the AngularJS project for a year and a half as a developer. And the stuff I work on is NgAnimates and Angular Dart and some of the form stuff in Angular Dart and module called NgMessages and a ton of other small things with AngularJS. And the way that I got involved with Angular in the first place was that 2 years ago, when I was first using it, when 1.0 came out, there were no blog articles about it. It was such a fresh new version. It was very hard for me to find material about it. I'd find old material from the older versions and then somehow put them together in my head. So I decided to blog about it on my blog, yurivmu.com, and that got me to become really good at Angular. And then after a short little while, I caught the attention of the team, and then I offered to build the animation system, and then that got me into there full time. And I really enjoy working on this framework. And the people in the community, the people who work on the team are really smart and intelligent, and it's a real delight to work with Angular. So other info about me, I have a degree in computer science, and I'm from Finland. And on a weekly basis, I code in 4 different programming languages. So I got a good sort of spectrum of different programming languages. Okay, so what are we talking about today? So we're going to really talk about the UI and how you can make your code into like a plugin-oriented type of code that you can reuse in other parts of your application and other libraries very easily. And then we're going to explore some of the other UI libraries, and then we're going to look into testing your component code and how you can debug it to figure out bugs and so on. So when I say UI, the UI could be anything. You know, it could be the emotional inputs to make the design work for a page. It could be the experience of the page. So I'm going to make it clear that when I'm speaking of the UI for this presentation, I'm talking about the combination between the scope and the template and the controller, and the balance that you need to have between all 3 of those facets to make your code as bestly reusable as possible. And typically that heads in the direction of directives. The more directives you have that are catered for your application, the more you can reuse them and the more you can compose them together. And I'm not going to be talking about animations really, but I wanted to give the example about how animations, when we put them together for Angular, we separated them from directives for this clear purpose that the animations are external to the structure of the page, to the data of the page. So when you're constructing your directives and you're constructing your templates, you want to have the idea in mind that the functional portion, which builds the UI, versus the data portion need to be separate. That being said, what is good UI when it comes to Angular? Well, anything that has simple template code that you're expressing in your template code is easy to follow and understand. Typically, this leads to having composable directives. Like if you take a look at the directives in Angular, such as ngIf or ngSwitch and all that stuff, those things, you can mix and match them together very well. And these are the types of directives that you want to develop on your own. And this typically means that, you know, finding the right sort of directive tricks to do the job. But in turn, you'll have small controllers that are only designed to give you data instead of designed to structure the page. On the other hand, what is bad UI? Now, before I got into Angular, I was a Rails developer, right? So with Rails, I would put everything into the controller for the view, and then the template would render, right? And having that mentality didn't really work too well with Angular because you don't want to have fat controllers where you put all the logic in there, and then the template somehow constructs itself off that. Not only that, it's because the template, anything in computer science programming that's just long is going to be hard to deal with. The more code, the harder it is to deal with. And when it comes down to the UI, you want to have small controllers, not fat controllers, and you don't want to abuse the scope by putting way too much stuff on there. So in other words, be expressive. Express your template with good, rich directives. And in general, directives should extend the nature of what HTML can do. So that being said, what's a good example of a directive? Well, the main component is that a directive splits the data from the function of the directive, so that the data that goes into the directive is not dependent on how the directive builds up the template. Let's take an example of a validator. So how many people have attempted to make their own validator in AngularJS for a form input model? Like, it's nothing complicated, But when it comes down to it, there's two ways to do it. You can either put the code inside of a controller and have all the validation happen in there, but then you have the data and the validation mechanism within the same controller. So here's a good example of how to do that. So let's add something like postal code validator for this one, which is going to validate a Canadian postal code. And if we do something like directive postal code validator, if I require NgModel, and I'll explain what this does in a minute, what I can do with this validator is, yeah, so what's a Canadian postal code's regex, right? We have letter, and then we have digit. Digit. Oh, okay, that's not something. There we go. There's our Canadian postal code. And let's validate this. Now let's add an error onto the page, div ngif, my form, my field, error postal. Okay, so what's happening here? We created a directive to handle the validator. And that validator is basically tapping into the NgModel controller, right? Now this is a little bit advanced, but the important thing here is that we're not putting this in our controller code, which is designed to handle our data. If we look at what happens when we view this page, see how the error pops up? Because of the parsers and formatters, which are designed to handle the validation. So here's a short example of having a directive handle the functional components, but the data is being passed in a different way. And this will be sort of what the talk is about. All right, so that being said, isolation is the answer. And I'm not talking about, putting yourself into a room and coding on your own. No, I mean isolation of components and code. And I can argue that the more that you learn how to isolate things properly and to provide sort of controlled inputs into those bodies of code, the better you'll be. And there should be no reason why you shouldn't be following this methodology when you're coding always when it comes to Angular. Okay, so let's make another example of tic-tac-toe. So how many people have code that looks like this? And right here, I'm trying to make a 3x3 grid to have like a tic-tac-toe game. And I end up having code like this. And what happens to my controller code? I end up shaping my controller code to form fit around the directive. Because, or not the directive, the template. So what's happening here is we have rows and we have columns. And the trouble with this is that how can I separate these two down the road? I'm going to have this big controller that has this data that's designed specifically for this template. Well, the HTML code might be simple and easy to understand, but the scope data is form-fitted and just too terse. Like somebody who's new to Angular and sees this and sees a full template full of this, you're not going to want to use it. It would be actually better if you made this a directive. So let's see what that looks like then. If we made this a directive, and we took the HTML code out of there and we passed it into the inline template code, and then we use the controller to do the form fitting for us, right? We pass it in a series of numbers and it puts it into a grid-like fashion. This is definitely an improvement. So what does the controller look like? Well, the controller just has the values for the tic-tac-toe table, but the HTML code here basically has just the controller and then the directive together. The controller is handling the data, the directive is handling the structure of the UI. But there's one key piece of information we're missing here. We can't extend this directive. We can't hop in there and add in extra code within the directive to render out each cell of the tic-tac-toe table, right? So in the end, there's really no real benefit. You're just kind of trapping your ineffective templating code elsewhere and then giving a single div element to do that. So how could we possibly make this better to give us something like this, where we can leverage the benefits of the controller and have a directive that builds out the template for us? Well, the trick to doing this is that this actually looks very similar to ngRepeat. And with ngRepeat, you can pass in data, and then it repeats itself, and then that renders in the DOM. How does it do this? Has anybody used transclude before? Right. Has anybody used the transclude function inside of a directive before? Yeah. It's a little bit different, but the code's really cool. Basically, if you call transclude element, what's going to happen is transclude element terminal, it's going to take the template of the element where the directive sits, and it's going to make a clone of that into a template. And then whenever you call this transclude function, it's going to make a new instance of that clone. So for example, we have the cells for tic-tac-toe. So you notice here how I'm passing in 9. So 9 is getting passed into the directive. The directive sees that, and it builds out the element 9 times, and then injects it into the page using element.after. So if we look at So if you look at the page right here, let's add the number in there to work. So let's go tic-tac, example 3. Oh. Sorry, editor symbol screen. Okay, fix that. All right, so our template code, we can pass in anything inside of here with this transclude function. This is a really key component when it comes to shaping up good directives in Angular code. And once again, it's this transclude function that gets delivered into the directive when you use transclude element. Make a good note of this. This will be very useful when it comes to making your own plugins and components. All right, so what were the pros and cons of that? The biggest pro and con is that you can use the high-level Angular code. You can put the template code that Angular understands and put it inside of that directive, and when the directive does its thing, it's going to render that code as well. The controller that's in charge is just going to be in charge of the data. The complexity of the directive might be a little bit too much code, but once you kind of understand how this works, then you can use services to reduce the amount of code. So the point is, when you have directives that are sort of designed to render out the view, you're only left with simple templates and simple controller code, and which is essentially a separation of the construction and data within the application. So bottom line, isolate the construction into a directive. Put all the construction code into that directive, which builds the UI. I keep repeating it, it is so useful. And if anyone's familiar with web components, like the new HTML technology, this is kind of how they work, right? They have the underlying code which builds the components, and then whatever is passed into the div element, HTML element that's in charge, will affect the rendering. So since this stuff, some of it's old news, some of it's new news, some of it's just patterns, it's important to keep yourself up to date because there could be new features in Angular that are released with new versions, so read the change log. Keep a heads up when it comes to tutorials on the internet because they might be outdated. Look at the date, look at the comments, see what people are saying with them because you could be implementing something that the patterns might be outdated for that. So this embraces the template in a way. And we can use the template to leverage even more functionality by using communication between different controllers within the template. Now, you might argue that we need to use controller scope events to communicate between controllers. And yes, that is definitely possible. However, using it this way, you can basically have all the simple template level stuff interact with different controllers. So let's take an example. This is what a controller as function looks like. So who here has used this before? It's not that new of a feature, but okay. So is anyone here using it exclusively and not using the regular controller stuff? Okay, good, good. Basically, controller as allows us to, instead of placing stuff on the scope, we're placing it on the instance of the controller. So you see here I'm doing comment controller as comment. All of this stuff for this is going to be placed on that comment object. And the benefit to this is it's like object-oriented programming. It's like a class that has instance methods and instance values. And some of these values could be private to the functions in the class. And the reason why I emphasize this is that with Angular 2, this could very well just be the default when it comes to designing controllers. Angular Dart already does this by default. I'm going to take this a step further and introduce directive controllers. Now, this is nothing special. It's completely similar to what we saw before. But the difference here is that instead of using NgController to sort of bind the controller to the page, we're just going to make a directive that does this. Now, this isn't a sort of consistent pattern, but the benefits that you get from doing this, you'll see in the next slides why it's really useful to do it. And see here how I have this attribute as comment. Basically, that's just attaching it to the scope in the same way as controller as works. Okay, so let's take an example of a multi-level form. Here we have a form that has one controller which manages all of the form, right? And the problem with this is that as the form expands, so will the controller. And you're going to end up having one controller that just manages one form, and you can't take out bits and pieces of that, and you have so much testing code to make this thing work. So you want to sort of break it down into other controllers. Let's actually see what this looks like. One second. Okay, so here's our form, right? The form essentially has basically have a form that inputs a bunch of colors, right? And if I change the type of color, say hex, you can see that the placeholder changes, right? So we have our ngRepeat, which lists the colors, and then we have a controller which is in charge of the code. So this controller is a fat controller. It's managing everything. It's managing the data for the placeholder. It's managing the data for adding a new color, removing a color. What happens if we add more properties to the color we're going to have to add into this controller? That's not the way to go. Not only that, but this controller knows way too much about the details of the model per se in the template. So for example, we don't really care about a placeholder. The placeholder is something that lives in the template, so why should the controller know about it? Why should the controller have to manage this? If we were to, so reiterating on what I said, when a controller does way too much, it does more than what it's designed to do, that's breaking the law of Demeter, and it just turns into a fat controller. So how could we break this up? We could have two controllers. We could have a top-level form controller, and we could have one for each instance of a color in the repeater. Okay, this is good so far. So you see here how I'm doing NgController. And you see how I'm actually putting color equal to color. So how do we pass a value that's in a template back to the controller that's instantiated? So here's another cool trick that you can do with Angular. In the code, you can inject $adders. And those are the attributes that are found on the div element, which is rendering the NgController. And in here, we get a hold of the color, and then we can handle the placeholder stuff and the color-specific stuff in that form. While the form controller is only handling adding or removing colors to the page. So what's good about this then? We have more isolation. Basically, the color controller is doing its own thing. And the only problem with this is there's still a strict inheritance. Whatever I place on the form controller on the top will get inherited to the color controller layer on the form. So if we use controller as to do this, we can basically split off each instance of the controller into its own object, and then as we split them off into their own objects, for example, form controller as form color controller as color form, the inner template can call the parent controller, and this is the communication I'm talking about. When you use controller as, you have an alias in the template, and one piece of code can call another piece of code very easily. And you don't have to make this in your JavaScript code. So this is another really good feature to use when constructing good template code. And here's what the controller code looks like for these. Instead of using scope, we're using this.color equals this function equals that. So the communication in the template is a really nice feature. But what else is cool? Basically, the problem with this is that we have too much verbosity in our code. We have NgController, and then we have a color getting passed in. How can we improve this? Well, if we use the directive controllers, which I mentioned before, we can simply give the directive a color, or give the directive a name, such as color form controller, and then we reference it as that name. But there's one major benefit to doing this. The benefit to this is that, yes, the controller code for the form will work as it did before. You see here how we have color form. But the benefit is that since we put this into directive, we have access to the DOM. And at the same time, I can require the other directive into this directive, into that controller. So this means that the controller for the color one, instead of having to have it in the template code, it can just say, give me the instance of the controller. I'm going to inject it into my directive, and therefore I can use the bits and pieces that I need to do with it. So you see here, for example, I have made a function called remove. But how does color form know how to remove itself? Because the removal of it happens in the parent form. If I just say remove, nothing's going to happen, right? So the method for remove on the color controller is actually calling the parent controller within the JavaScript because I injected the controller. So when you use directive controllers, you can leverage both the template to handle communication and JavaScript to handle communication. The only con with this is that the JavaScript code is a little bit obscure because Angular wasn't entirely designed to do this. However, with version 2.0 possibly, and I know with Angular Dart right now, this is the way that things are done by default. So these directive controller hybrids are the way to go. And when it comes to actually using controllers on your own, just use them for the view and use them for your own data. But then when it comes down to building the page, use directive controllers. So before we actually look at making a plugin, let's take an example of a new feature in Angular called NgMessages. Okay, so we have a form, right? And the form has our postal code as well. So based on what we had before with this validator example, so I enter a value and the value shows, right? But I'm using an ngIf in this example. Right? I'm using this complex ngIf statement that's listening on this particular form, right? Or this particular input field on the form. How can I make this better? Well, if we use this new system in Angular called NgMessages, we can effectively make a collection of error messages going like this, where it goes NgMessages for, let's give this name postal code. We'll say my form postal code $error. And in here, I can specify each error message that is associated with this validation. So let's say I just say NgMessage for required. You did not enter a postal code. And now let's make another one for min length. And let's say that your postal code is too short. And then we'll have another one that says your postal code is invalid. And this one will be for the postal error. Has anybody used this feature before? Okay. So what's going to happen now is that Angular is going to check to see which error should show up first. So the required error has higher priority. Therefore, when you're entering a field in a form and you don't enter anything, you don't want to see that the form is invalid, the field is invalid. You'd rather see a message that says, hey, enter this field, hey, enter that field. Okay, so the error message is required. Then you're going to have a min length and a postal. So let's add required, and then let's add ng min length. And I know that a postal code, if it's less than 6 characters, it's automatically invalid. And then finally, let's add our postal code validator that we created earlier. So let me just copy that over. So let's see how this looks. Okay, so far it's saying you did not enter your postal code. If I press 1 character, it says your postal code is too short. And if I enter 6 characters, now it's invalid. But if I enter my postal code, for example, it's valid. So this is kind of how NgMessages is built. And NgMessages uses the stuff I was talking about to render these error messages in a smart way. And this is actually an additional module when it comes with Angular 1. If you download the latest 1.3, you'll see that there's a file called Angular Messages. And you need to include the NgMessages module. But this is a plugin. And the plugin has certain features that we would like to hook into. So how can I hook into the NgMessage API without having to butcher up my template code? Let's say that I wanted to make an additional message, say special message, right? Let's put ... for now, right? Right now, a special message is always going to be visible. However, if I wanted to make a directive, and we want to call this one special message, what I can do in here is I can require NgMessages, and then in my link function, I gain access to that. So if I do a console log, for example, here, and look at what happens. Oh, it's complaining. Oh, so you see here it's not finding it, so I have to actually type in a caret, which means it's an apparent. It's a parent element has this controller attached to it. Okay, so I got the constructor, right? Now there's special API features that I can look into from that plugin. So for example, there's the register message. I can render the element classes on them. These are all things that NgMessages uses internally. So this is kind of what I mean by making a plugin work in this way. So when you have a proper naming convention and you store everything inside of one module, it's very easy to extend and hop into. And then everything's a custom directive, and you use these tricks to sort of expand and build the layout for you. And then the CSS obeys, then you have a really good plugin. So how do you store this plugin? Typically, you just make a directory inside of your application called My Plugin, and then you just have the assets that are associated with it. And if you were to copy and paste that and put it into an application, you just load the module and it'll work. So how do you say this? You can use Bower, or you can use ngModules to do this. There isn't a distinct way to store and download modules with Angular right now, but at least you know how to package it up together. So outside of plugins, what are some popular plugin libraries that you could use? So we have UI libraries like UI Bootstrap and Angular Strap. We have Breeze and Restangular, require.js and Browserify. So let's talk about these libraries for a second. Angular UI is a framework that's built off of Bootstrap, but instead of actually using the Bootstrap JavaScript code, it uses its own Angular code to hook into that. And which means that it might not be compatible with a website that uses just Bootstrap code on its own. And it uses its own animation code. Then on the other hand, you have Angular Strap, which is also fairly popular. And it's not like it's a direct competitor to Angular UI. The difference here is that it actually just uses Bootstrap, and then it has these pass-through functions that make use of the plugins. What about Kendo UI? So Kendo UI has a pricing model, so keep that in mind. It has good mobile support, but there's a better selection of widgets, and it has Angular hooks that can hop into it. The Angular integration is a little bit sort of like they have some special code and controllers and so on, but it is definitely usable. Okay, so let's hop into some code and debug a component. All right, so let's go back to our NgMessages example, right? Here we have a particular piece of code, and if, for example, I were to enter, actually, let's hop into the tic-tac-toe example. Okay, so here we have a tic-tac-toe board. How can I debug and figure out how my components are working and why they're not working properly? So let me just get to that page. Okay, so let's say I added something like index I right here. And now all the fields disappear. How could I hop in here and debug this on the page without sort of having to constantly refresh the page to see if it works? if I right-click on an element right here, and now the console shows up, if I type in $0, that element that I right-clicked on in inspect element, that is referenced as that special variable. Now, if I want to hop into the Angular world with that, I just type in Angular element $0, and now it's an Angular element. But that means I can just do .scope. And now I have all the data for the scope, which is assigned to this rendered element on the screen. So I can see here that index is here. Okay, so index is actually on that scope, which is correct. So if I click here, for example, and I do the same code, the $0 element has changed. And now if I type in .index, you'll see that it says 2. All right, so we know that our template is loading properly. We know that the data is getting passed in. So what's actually happening with our code? If I go back into the HTML code, I can actually test this code by gaining access to the element. So that's the scope. So if I do s, and I do s.eval, and I pass in its data, nothing gets returned. So if I actually change the expression, then it gives me the value. So using these little tricks of eval and using Angular element scope, you can hook into and debug the application as it goes. If anyone's used Batarang, which is the Angular scope detection tool, that you can, like the Chrome extension, this is kind of how it works behind the scenes. But you have all the possibilities just to hop into the console and debug it on your own. Okay, so what about testing components then? So it's very easy to test directives and components when the structure of building the component is separate from the data. So an example of this would be, let's hop into the testing page. Okay. So I have a directive here called expand. And I pass it a number and it's going to duplicate it that many times. So it's very similar to NgRepeat. If I were to, so this is what the definition for the directive looks like, right? What do we have here? We have the plugin HTML file. Then we have the controller, which essentially sets up the NgRepeat data. And if we look at plugin.html, you'll notice that it's just a NgRepeat. So it's the same thing we had before with the tic-tac-toe table. It's just disguising an NgRepeat so it can expand and contract it behind the scenes. Okay, so if I were to have this code directly in the page, like this, and let's say that I had a controller somewhere that would set items times, it is very difficult to test this. And what I mean test is not just debug it and see if it works, but actually write a unit test for it. Why? Because I'd have to load in this index.html file. I'd have to load the controller, I'd have to set up the scope, and so on. So when I've actually split it off into its own components, this means that I can test it much easier. So how would I actually hop into a test to test this controller? So the first thing to keep in mind is that the template is remote. That means that when the unit test is running, it's going to try to download it, but the Angular mocks thing is like, no, 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 you can't download this, this is an external file. So you use this trick with Karma, and I'm sure that somebody, like, who here doesn't know what Karma is? Okay. Karma is a test runner that will run a bunch of unit tests against multiple browsers. And it's the tool of choice when it comes to unit testing Angular applications. This is the definition file, but what we've done is we've said that this particular HTML file is going to run for a preprocessor. It's going to convert it into the special Angular module. And what that does is it just runs it and puts it into the template cache. And then, if we look at our unit test, plugin spec, you can see that we're just calling the module templates. So it's just an extra module which has all of those templates downloaded and put inside of the module directly. So if I run the test, so if I type in Karma start, you'll notice that's working. So what am I actually testing for? So what I mentioned before is, I just have a repeater that somehow expands itself to 5 times, right? And that's the bare functionality of this directive. So my unit test, the assertion code, is basically getting a hold of the text within the element. So you see here how I have, I can delete this. But if we look in the template code right here, it's just putting the item value. So if there's 5 items, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're testing that. Having to make your own template code and test your own template code this way would be very difficult, but once your directive is sort of isolated from the data, it's much easier. So within this test then, how can I actually hop in there and debug it? If I pass in a debugger value right now, and then inside the Karma instance it's running, and if I type in the console, or sorry, if I click on the debug button right here, now we're in a special page, and if I refresh, I have access directly into the unit test. So now all the data within the unit test, element and root scope and all that stuff, I can see what they look like. So you see here how I have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if I do element.text, it's going to give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how you can hop into your test and debug it while the unit test is running. So next time you're actually trying to fix a bug with Angular, and it's just a bug that you don't want to deal with in the future, make a test for it, because it's not that much extra work. And chances are, if you can actually separate the directive as well, you can probably reuse it in another part of the application. But that's it for my talk right now. And I hope that these tricks that you guys have learned when it comes to managing directives, managing components in Angular application, you'll put to use. And yeah, I have a few minutes for questions. Thank you. Questions? No questions? Come on. Okay, thank you.
Oh, wait.
What? Oh, there's a...
In your directives, when you were doing that, you had that custom as attribute that you're putting in your directive. How come you were just using the built-in directive? You can specify controller as for directive.
Yeah, so
Is that thing specified in the HTML or?
you can so I'll show you if I find it. Okay, I'll find it here. Okay, so this template code right here, I'm doing this right here. And if this controller was like a controller defined as, a dot controller, then I could use controller as in that way. So that's definitely possible. I'm just using it in here so that I'm showing it in one block instead of having to have multiple pieces. But if you can reuse the controller in a good way, then definitely do it that way.
Oh.
Yes?
Yeah, that whole NgMessage thing you were showing, it seems like the logic is starting to leak into the front end a little bit, into the markup.
Right.
I can see how validation can go both ways, but as soon as it starts getting a little more complicated than simple how many characters that we put in, it's starting to get into logic and the markup. How do you guys kind of decide where to draw the lines when you're developing these features for Angular?
Okay, so my motto is that the controller code should have no idea about the validations per se at all. It shouldn't care about if something is not of a certain length or if the pattern is invalid. All it cares about is that the controller, that the form is valid, right? And this means that you can have your template code and your directive code kind of scaling in their own ways and that they won't clash, right? You won't have to have a huge dependency between them. So yes, we can argue that there is kind of logic going on in here. But if you think about the actual validations, this is just rendering the messages, but the validators, for example, min length and so on, these are still in the JavaScript world. So we created the postal code validator. We created the JavaScript code to run that. So it's still not all happening inside of the template. If we had expressions that are just checking to see if the value is this and that, then yeah, that will get messy. But the whole point of it is that it's behind a directive that is designed to do that. Does that answer your question? Or? Yeah. Yes?
Wondering if these examples are available.
What I'll do is I'll put them up on a GitHub repo, and I'll have FITC tweet them out. Okay. Okay. Thank you, everybody.